1777, there was gradual emancipation of slaves. The American Revolution purports to be about freedom. The Bill of Rights is about individual freedom. The president of Emory University, who has had conferences on the slave trade, is the Methodist bishop who founded Emory University, founding John Emory, was a slave owner. And although John Wesley opposed slavery, most of the faculty, all of the first presidents, the large contributors, and everybody who worked on campus were slaveholders or slaves rented from nearby property. Slave tried to look into it. But he was a poor dear, and he said, you know, a great example of compromise was that blacks were 3/5 of a man to get more representation for their owners. So actually, the Creek Indians who had made a settlement in Georgia were expelled under Andrew Jackson, and there was the Trail of Tears, because of this 3/5 compromise between the slave owners and the North, in which the black folks, I'm sorry, there were a lot of free black folks, and I'll tell you about the role of the Revolution, were all left out. So because of the voting arrangements under which the slave owners got to represent their slaves as 3/5, the President of the United States for the first 72 years of the Republic, from George Washington to Abraham Lincoln in 1860, for 52 years of those years he was a slave owner. And the only presidents elected twice were slave owners. Now, if I say that to you, nobody taught me that in school. It's going to be a little chilling. That is to say, you don't have to know too much about it. This fellow named Henry Winchek wrote a really good book about Washington. And it's called Imperfect God, Washington, His Slaves, and the Creation of America. And if you read this book, it will break your heart. Washington raffled off children to pay his debts.
What was the book? I'm sorry, I can't hear.
Henry Winchek, Imperfect God is the name of the book. But more deeply, this book is in its second printing, and it's about to go in paperback. And I'm happy to tell you that I've been invited to speak at the UN for its International Day for the Remembrance of the Victims of Slavery and the Transatlantic Slave Trade later in the month, and at Harvard. And I'm going around talking about the book, and I'll get into it from Oxford and so on. And I'm going back, and this is an ongoing thing. And there's a tremendous amount of interest in the book. But this is the year of the 150th anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation, and we're barely getting our minds, and this includes, a lot of black people really know about this. But, you know, one of the things is I was on a show, that show, on January 1st, and with 3 people, all of them said, you know, we were never taught the Emancipation Proclamation in school. And I watched the movie Lincoln, and I know about Lincoln. But I hadn't a clear idea of the connection between the Emancipation Proclamation and the 13th Amendment. And this movie makes the black soldiers the backdrop to the movie. But actually, the Emancipation Proclamation did the following thing. 80% of the soldiers who joined the Union Army after January 1st, 1863 were black. That's in a new book by Bruce Levine, Fall of the House of Dixie. The Times hasn't reviewed it yet. It's a little too strong, I think, or true.
What's the percentage, Ellen?
80.
80%.
4/5 of the new soldiers who defeated the South, it was the turn in the war, were ex-slaves. And by the way, slaves and Native Americans came to the Union side throughout the war. There's a whole sub-history from 1862 on of people fighting the Confederacy from below, which doesn't make the Times, but it's actually a big deal. So anyway, it's very interesting. There's a bestseller about Thomas Jefferson by a guy named Meacham, who was an editor of Newsweek, and he's very well connected, and it was reviewed by the reporting pages editor, Jill Abramson. And she didn't like the book actually that much, but she told you that really Jefferson was good at settling big-arms, so you should have it on your coffee table for this reason. Right?
I'm sorry, I can't hear you.
your book on your coffee table because Jefferson was good at settling gridlock. And then they reviewed it during the week, and this was a more sarcastic reviewer and said that Jefferson was no good about slavery. But then on the op-ed page, by the leading scholar of the Constitution and slavery, Paul Finkelman, who teaches at SUNY Albany, and I know a bit, we're having a panel next year at the political science meetings. He wrote a book called, he wrote an op-ed piece in the New York Times called The Monster of Monticello. And he just describes to you what Jefferson's views were, including what Jefferson said on Notes on Virginia about black people. One of the things he said, when he was governor, he tried to get black women who had children with white men expelled from Virginia.
In other words, like his own lover.
Thomas Jefferson. There are a lot of good things about Jefferson, but Jefferson was a really, really, really unpleasant racist. And it is not inaccurate to refer to him as the monster of Monticello. And I don't know if this is a crowd in which everybody saw Django.
No.
But I would just say about it that actually, unfortunately, I think it is fair to say that there's more similarity between Candyland and Monticello than there is difference. This is the most decent piece, which is still in the light of presidents, because what you're allowed to discuss in America, and what they have endless recycled bestsellers about is George Washington X, Ben Franklin X, Tom Jefferson X, right? Lincoln, it's a biopic. It doesn't tell you about Elizabeth Cady Stanton drafting the 13th Amendment. It doesn't tell you how it was fought for from below. It doesn't give you the history of the rank and file. It isn't from below. How did presidents look at it? And it's nice. It doesn't depict Thaddeus Stevens as a demon. Because he wasn't. He was actually a good guy. He actually said slavery's no good. I think even the reactionaries on the Supreme Court agree now, in public, that slavery is no good. So what my book is about is the following. Social historians since the Civil Rights Movement have become aware of something that particularly radicals and black historians have long been aware of. There's a long history of revolt from below in America. And there are serious movements for abolition in the American Revolution. That's how we got gradual emancipation in the world. And all of this has been buried. So I read a book by a famous historian, a very good guy named Gary Nash, who writes about, he has a book called Red, White, and Black, about the divisions between Native Americans, blacks who were enslaved, and white indentured servants, which were quite deliberate under the British. And the new administrations here wanted to preserve that. That is, they liked these divisions because it enabled some people to get rich, if I may say, and other people not to get together and threaten. So Nash wrote a book called Race and Revolution, which I read, and he discusses on 2 pages this issue, and he says, a gigantic number of slaves escaped and fought for the British in exchange for freedom. How many we will never know. And when he said that, I stopped because I had been taught by a guy famous teacher of comparative revolutions, Barrington, that the American Revolution wasn't a revolution. The Civil War was a revolution because it overthrew slavery. The American Revolution is basically a change of personnel. So there are a few good things, but it's basically a change of personnel, and Barrington was never interested in. And I read Hannah Arendt's very moving book on it, and she mentions slavery once and she runs away. And so I read this, and I said, gee whiz, if anything like this is true, the American Revolution is A, a social revolution, and B, he later describes this as the American Revolution's dirty secret. The reason that Americans tend to write pieces of the stories, and not the whole story, is most slaves escaped to the British and were freed by the British. So it makes the claim of the American Revolution to be a revolution for freedom ambiguous. That is, if the most oppressed people are fighting on the other side, or being freed by the other side, it's not going to help if you say you're for freedom, right? Especially you beholden slaves, like George Washington and Thomas Jefferson. And there were people who were very anti-slavery on the American side, but they've been buried to some extent. So this is one side of it, the British side. But I thought my book would get a lot of coverage, including in the Times. It was Chicago's lead book in history for last year. the first book in their catalog. They gave it a full page on page 12. And they put a lot into building it, and they told me it would get reviewed in the Times and the New York Review books. Very likely. And it didn't get reviewed in the Times. And I tried to figure out why. And at least one of the reasons why is that the independent action of poor blacks and whites, which I'll tell you about, against slavery and to fight for abolition, which I think was the propelling force in the revolutionary crowds like the Boston Tea Party, that's a little bit further than the New York Times is prepared to go in unraveling this myth. That's a little bit too much unamnesia, as the Greeks say. The truth is aletheia, not forgetting. And so you can relearn what's true if you ask questions. Sometimes. So about this, as I was doing this research, I put 16 years into this book, and because I'm a political philosopher publishing history, and this is the solid gold in American history, this is hard to publish in. And so I had to have a lot of persistence. So I'll say that. But fortunately, I do have enough persistence, and I did get the book out, and I got a magical editor, so it was 23 chapters, and it's now 9 beautiful chapters. And the historian was mainly interested in being 9 chapters, and we had it out over various things. We reviewed the book, and when he claimed that 6 things I said weren't right, and I showed that 3 of them were right, he was wrong about them, and 2 of them I was partly right, and 1 of them I couldn't sustain, and so he wasn't necessarily right, but I didn't have the goods. But it was, well, necessarily because there's a question about it. I can't tell you the whole deal, right? So you have to take my silly word for it. But anyway, you could say, I often make mistakes, so I'm sure I get some things wrong. But anyway, it's quite, it really is, as most historical works are, a beautiful historical novel. But it is historical, more than it's a novel. And this is actually a complicated issue, because most historical writing, particularly about the American Revolution, is more novel than it is historical. I could give you some examples of that, but I won't. So what happened was this, and I thought it would get the New York Times to cover it as a pay-for-play story. There's a German private named Georg Daniel Flohr, and he fought on the American side with the Patriots, with the French, the Royal Dupont. And there's actually a famous leader of the Haitian Revolution, Henri Christophe, who fought on the American side with the French, and then went back to Haiti and helped the revolution. And Flohr walked around the field of Yorktown, the crucial battle of the American Revolution, the day afterwards. And he saw all the dead lying around the field. And he went and he wrote in his diary, and I found this out from a guy who hasn't written much, teaches at Hope College at Moravian School in Michigan. He wrote a little article on this. And when I found the article, I went and read the things in it, and it turned out he was right. What Flohr said was, most of the corpses lying around the field, most of the dead, were Moors. Most of the dead on both sides at the Battle of Yorktown, fighting for Cornwallis and fighting for George Washington, were black folks. Now, that was pretty stunning. I deciphered a lot of this, and I break down this quantitatively, so I show a lot of stuff about this. Most people don't recognize this, is all I'll say. They repeat figures of other people who are working on particular things. So about the setting, they tell you whatever's in the literature. If they are modest and sympathetic to it, they just repeat it. They don't check it. And what I did was go through 16 research libraries here and there, so countries. I got Canada on the web. I actually went to various libraries in England and Spain and France and got all sorts of stuff. And they're magical documents, but you have this question about what did black folks do in the Revolution? And can you find evidence that black soldiers were central to the American Revolution? And boy, was there marvelous evidence. So anyway, he said this. So I began looking into it. And I found out that in the 1750s, there were 20 revolts against slavery in the Caribbean, starting in Jamaica, attacking Jamaica. And these were a very big deal because a lot of the sailors, black and white, were folks walking down the street. And the Navy came, the British Navy, the Imperial Navy, and they grabbed him. And then, if he didn't fall off the mast and become shark bait, you were it. right? So these folks who went and saw these slave revolts, they said, how they're like us? We're like them. Black folks thought that, but the radical white sailors thought that too. And there's some very good books on the sailors. When they came to London in 1760, there's a guy named J. Fillmore, just the initial J, and he has a pamphlet, you can get it up on the web, called Two Dialogues Concerning the Man Trade. And he had talked to these black and white sailors, and he wrote about how it was unchristian to trade in human lives, and it was right for people to fight this and redesign Locke's state of nature. And he said, in the state of nature, everyone is equal, red and white and black. And in 1764, this came to Boston, and James Otis, a great figure in the American Revolution, who was wounded in a duel, and so actually toward the end of the Revolution, and basically died shortly thereafter. He wrote, the rights of the British colonists asserted and proved in 1764, and he says, every man has natural rights, black as well as white. 1764, 11 years before the American Revolution broke out. In every poor folks' tavern, this is what they discuss. One of the main kinds of rebellions in the American Revolution is rebellions against the Stamp Act. There's the Boston Tea Party, dumped the tea for the taxes on tea. And the riots against the press gangs. Integrated riots of black and white people. My guess is that as with the Iraq War, the only people who supported it were talking heads. They didn't talk to anybody in the anti-war movement. If you take the 2004 convention where John Kerry had Medea Benjamin, who had a banner which said, U.S. get out of Iraq, called off, but he didn't have her arrested. I would guess 90% of the people who were at that convention thought she was right. In fact, I would guess John Kerry thought she was right. If John Kerry didn't think she was right, John Kerry's an idiot. The fact is that I haven't had a student in 5 years who can think of a reason why the U.S. got into Iraq. And by the way, if you say humanitarian... Huh?
Yes, where he is today.
Oh, well.
He's now as Secretary of State. What do you think about that?
Well,
Yeah, we go.
in the questions, because I got a lot to get through. So look,
Right.
there was this big movement from below, which pressed. It was also a Christian movement, because Christians felt every loss the U.S. had before. It was because we had committed the sin of slavery. We were being punished by God for the sin of slavery. And Samuel Hopkins, a New Life preacher in Newport, Rhode Island in 1775, spoke of slavery as a sin of crimson dye. And he said the British, this is Governor Dunmore of Virginia, are recruiting and freeing blacks and indentured servants to fight for them because they don't have that many people to fight. As I said, Dunmore said, starting in 1772, all the blacks come to me and I will free you if you proud colonists rebel, and I will sow destruction wherever I can reach, and I will raise your mansions to the ground. And he kept repeating that until 1775. The whole South rebelled as a precursor or parallel to the Civil War. They seceded from Britain in order to maintain slavery. That was the main reason. There are other reasons, but that was the main reason. In South Carolina, there weren't even other reasons. And that was the reason. So, this is one element in the American Revolution, but the other element is this force from below, which says freedom, including black folks. Now, the British would say sarcastic things, like Samuel Johnson said about the demonstrator. He said, how come, in 1775, we hear the greatest yelps for liberty from the drivers of slaves? I don't know about you, but I was never taught that, just like I was never taught about it before. So, I think, there are a lot of remarks in American politics. I would say this is the Tea Party. That, what is said barely has the currency of getting it out of somebody's mouth. I don't mean this, by the way, about Rand Paul and drums. I think actually he says something intelligent about them, which one would be best to worry about. But most of the things aren't very intelligent. Keep the government's hands over my Social Security. Things like that. The original Tea Party slogans. Hard to make sense of that. So, the thing about it is that Samuel Johnson says something that was true, and the Quakers kept saying this.
Oh.
How come you get upset about a 3-penny tax on tea and not the slavery of a person for a whole life?
Yeah.
And I would say that the reason they don't have you read that is you're not going to feel so good about the American Revolution to read that. You might feel good about the American Revolution if you read my book and you found there was this big movement to free slaves. And actually, there was a great guy from Carolina, South Carolina, named John Morris, who ought to be one of the great heroes of the American Revolution. And he was Washington's assistant, and he fought to free the slaves. And for South Carolina and Georgia to free 5,000 slaves in exchange for fighting against the British, because the British were recruiting blacks, and the Americans had to recruit blacks. There was big military competition. It passed the Continental Congress. And it wouldn't pass the Continental Congress except George Washington approved it, because George Washington knew that the people who stayed in the Army longest and fought hardest for freedom were the 1st Rhode Island Regiment, which was made up of black and Narragansett Indian troops, recruited in 1778, and several other black regiments. And when he had to, his advisors like Baron von Clausen said, these are the best under arms, these are the best in maneuvers, mainly because the other soldiers were recruited for 10 months. And they mainly left after 10 months.